Hey there everyone, it's Jaycee. Chances are you've made one of these few mistakes while crafting. No need to start over, let's take a look at a few simple ways to fix them. Again, crafting mistakes are bound to happen. That doesn't mean your project is ruined or you have to start over. Maybe your card will take you in a different and better direction. For my first card, one of the first things I'm going to grab is the Majestic Bouquet. This is a large 8.5 by 11 stamp set featuring 2 clusters of flowers and also coordinating leaves. And I've got mine in a page protector, just a normal US letter size 8.5 by 11 page protector sheet. And I'm also able to slide in the Majestic Bouquet die set right into the protective sleeve that I have here. Like all new Altenew stamps, it comes with the package trifold for other inspiration as well. In my stamp positioning tool, I've got a panel of white cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 5.5. And I'm using jet black crisp ink to stamp the ruffled peony outline image. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, I'm not so good about cleaning off my photopolymer stamps. My recommendation is using the Altenew stamp cleaner or a microfiber cloth to wipe off the dye ink on the surface. But I know for myself, when I'm trying to catch up on deadlines, I find it really tempting to just peel the stamp off. And maybe I wasn't so good at wiping the surface of the stamp, but then I'll get ink on my fingers and transfer the ink onto an undesired part of my image. So in the end, I'm going to show you how to remedy these unwanted inked areas on your card panel. I don't believe in starting over unless there's something that's just so irreparable about your project. But as American artist Bob Ross says, there's no mistakes, just happy accidents. So I'll just take this up as an opportunity for learning and just to correct some small little card accidents that happen every once in a while. So I will continue to stamp my outline images onto my cardstock panel. Now that I have my stamped outline images, I'll work on adding in the subsequent detail layers. I'm going for a different color palette today. I'm going to use Red Cosmos crisp ink families on the flowers, and then Coffee Break as my foliage colors. And generally, I'm going to follow the instructions on the package trifold. I may leave out layers here and there just for a little bit of variation. As I'm inking up this solid image with Rocky Shore, I'm actually running into one of the more common mistakes I make as well while crafting, is not conditioning my photopolymer stamp. So you'll notice the surface of my stamp has pulled up the ink since the surface of the photopolymer stamp is slick. And then when I go to bring the ink over to my stamping surface, I get a spotty impression. Now for me, I have the luxury of a stamp positioning tool, but I realize not everybody has the budget or the availability for something like this. So on the secondary image, I can demonstrate what to do in order to prevent this stamp pooling. In this case, for my first image, I could just stamp this image again, and that would resolve the pooling that I would get. Or starting again from this really slick surface, I can use the Altenew stamp conditioning eraser. I also use this for other crafty hacks, but for this example, I'm going to use the flat surface to sort of rough up the surface of the photopolymer stamp. And don't worry, this doesn't cause any sort of physical damage to your stamp. If anything, it leaves just a rubber residue, just like erasing any sort of regular paper. And what it does is it'll now dull the surface of your stamp. If there are any large particles, you can just go ahead and brush it off with your fingers. But now when I add this ink, I will now get a flat, even wash of ink that I can then bring to my stamp surface. And I will definitely get a crisp impression this time around. Eventually this will settle out, but in some cases, if you have really dark pigments, this may not resolve, so you would either have to stamp it again or just hope that the next detail layer will cover some of this imperfection that you have on your surface. The dull surface of your stamp can be washed away now by using soap and water under a sink. Or you can again use the Altenew stamp cleaner to get the surface off. So again, I'll use my stamp conditioning eraser before I do any stamping on my paper and integrate this into my stamping routine just to get a dull surface on the photopolymer stamp. Then I can apply my next dye ink to the surface, and this ensures a nice crisp and uniform image and layer on my layering image. I have all my images inked and stamped. Now I'm going to use the coordinating Majestic Bouquet die set to cut out all the images on my white cardstock panel. And here are all my die cut elements for my card. Now before I arrange any of these elements onto my card front, now Altenew has done something pretty unique with this large 8.5 by 11 stamp set, which has also released a texture embossing folder or a 3D embossing folder called Majestic Bloom that coordinates with Majestic Bouquet. So you can see some of these images already coordinate with this embossing folder. So now we can add another interesting textural element to these already dynamic images. Getting these images lined up in the embossing folder is really easy. I just have to look through the embossing folder and align the image like you would a layering stamp. And I'm just going to make minor adjustments here and there just to make sure I get a good alignment. And then all I have to do is follow my embossing folder sandwich on my large die cutting machine. And now not only do I get a beautifully layered image, I also get one with a lot of texture to it as well. I'll repeat that for the remaining images that I've die cut. I have a pretty rough layout of my card front. Now just as a quick tip here and sort of as design elements, I have a really textured card with a lot of dimension, so I feel like something that's going to help balance this is some flatness. So here I've got the Altenew Vase Fillers stamp set. It does have a coordinating die set, but I'm not going to worry about that for this project. I'm more concerned about these two solid images here. I'm going to use a little piece of Glad Press and Seal wrap to pick everybody up at the same time. So I can gently move it off of my Altenew cutting mat and then work on the background piece to this card. Now in here I've got a panel of spicy yogurt cardstock. I thought the warmth of this background element would coordinate with the overall warmth of the peony bouquet I have here. And then by bringing in the bouquet to my background panel, I can roughly plan where I want the vase fillers images to go. And like I mentioned earlier, to prevent my number one crafty mistake, I'm going to use the stamp conditioning eraser to dull the surface of the photopolymer stamp, especially for the stamps that have a very large solid area to them. And now hopefully you can see here that I've got a dull image to my photopolymer stamp surfaces. I'm going to use Lava Rock crisp dye ink from the Warm Gray family of inks. To ink up and stamp these solid images onto my background panel. Now that I have my background panel complete, I can start assembling my bouquet on top of my background. Now I use a liquid glue to adhere my background panel to my folded note card base. And every once in a while I might be a little too generous in applying some liquid glue and it oozes out the side around here. I can use my stamp conditioning eraser to sort of use it as an adhesive remover and remove the liquid adhesive that has oozed out the sides here. And that also works, for example, when I start gluing my floral arrangement to my note card base. If I have any stray adhesive, this is also a good alternative for an adhesive remover as well. Now that I've finished arranging the floral elements to my card, before I add my sentiments, I'm going to work on that mistake I made earlier. So that's when I touched the surface of the photopolymer stamp and transferred the ink onto another part of my card that I didn't want. And in this case, this flower happens to show that area of ink that I didn't want. And instead of trying to cover it up, I feel like whenever I try to cover something up To me, it always looks like I intentionally tried to cover something up in some aspect. So what I like to do instead of covering up a mistake is to sort of exemplify it or exaggerate it. So in this case, I have an area of unwanted ink. So I'm going to create an array of unwanted splatters, if you like. And if you've been watching my Perfect Pairing series here on the Altenew channel for a while, you'll know that one of my favorite ways to add ink splatter is by using Jet Black ink spray. Now, while I can fully identify where my mistake was made, it looks to me sort of intentional because I've sort of spread the unwanted ink area and sort of amplified it or echoed it across my cardstock here. To finish this card, I added a very simple Hello Sentiment banner from the Majestic Bouquet stamp set. And that finishes this card showing two examples of my most common mistakes. So one of them is unwanted ink transfer, and the other is preventing ink splotchiness by using the stamp conditioning eraser by properly conditioning your photopolymer stamp sets. Most of the time, small 2x3 stamp sets will automatically add into your carts, and finding out about these free stamp sets are just as easy as signing up for their email list. What I love about these images is that they pair beautifully with other items in your Altenew stash, and sometimes it's just as easy as matching the categories. So in this case, I just have to look for two green tabs, and then I know these two stamp sets will work really well together. And yes, just like any other Altenew release, there's tons of inspiration on the Altenew website for you to check out. So what I'm going to do with this small stamp set is use my collection of Altenew artist markers. I'll be sure to condition the stamp just as normal with the stamp conditioning eraser. And then with any alcohol-based marker coloring, I'll use the Altenew Permanent Black Crisp ink. Once I have a good impression, I'll trim down my panel to a more manageable size and use my array and collection of Altenew artist markers to color this image. One of the more common mistakes I make with Altenew artist markers is just coloring outside of the line. Now with watercolor, it's easy to just sort of dab this off. But with alcohol inks, we have a different alternative for lifting ink in unwanted places. The colorless blender, 0, or if you've got the decals, the blender tip, is perfect for pushing unwanted ink into the paper. The blender is not really meant to erase or lift ink. What it's doing is pushing the ink into the surface of the paper so that it is no longer sitting in the surface. Now right now it still looks a little wet. It'll dry back and then you will no longer see that ink on the surface. I have a little blemish on this side as well, but my hand is going to cover it. And all I'm doing is sort of doing brush strokes and sort of dabbing the blender ink onto that unwanted area of ink. And what will happen is that unwanted blemish will sink into the surface of the paper and will no longer sit on top. So you can see this is sort of mostly dried back by now. And that little purple blemish has essentially disappeared. So I find the Altenew artist marker in the color list or 0 blender for erasing those unwanted areas of ink. I'm just finishing up coloring this rainbow cup that I made, and I added white highlights with a gel pen. And now that I'm done with my coloring, I'll just use my simple craft scissors to fussy cut this image, and I'll set it aside and work on the next element on my perfect pairing. I dove into my scrap drawer from the Altenew Wildflower 12x12 paper pack, and I found this little piece here. I used this in one of my designs for one of the scrapbook pages I made for the release. And I'm just going to adhere, and I'm going to adhere this onto a panel, a white panel of 3 3/4 by 5 inches. And I'm doing that just for a little textural element to my card front. Here's that graphic brush strokes stamp set from earlier. And I'm going to use this image right here and mount it to an acrylic block. And again, with these really solid images, I'm going to make sure to use the stamp conditioning eraser to make sure I get crisp, clean impressions. And I'm going to use pink pearl to stamp this brush stroke image in this sort of heart formation. Going back to one of my first 2 tips in this video, I add splatter just because, honestly, there doesn't have to be any mistake. I just love adding it. And in this case, I don't want to introduce any more black. So what I'm going to do is use another red ink to add splatters to this background here. Now, alternatives to using an acrylic block for this technique is just to use some kind of slick surface. Now, this is what the stamp came in, this little Altenew packaging here. And I can use this as a sort of media mat to dispense a little bit of the ink pad, then add just a few drops of water to get this fluid. Now I don't want ink on my main image here, so I'm just going to put it to the side. And then I can suspend the dye ink with the water and use this to add my splatters. In order to add my sentiment to this card, I want to do something a little bit non-traditional. This is one of the sentiments in Graphic Brush Strokes stamp set. And it's actually one of my favorites because of the styling of the letter, and I think it's just perfect for a love card. I want to add this sentiment directly on top of all of this without creating any sort of sentiment strip or using vellum. And I want my main image, my main focal image, to be in the orientation that you see here. So I'm going to add a little bit of temporary tape. This is just a little bit of Altenew washi tape to the back of my image. And I'm going to position the image as if I'm going to permanently adhere it to my background panel here. Then in my stamp positioning tool, I'm going to bring my sentiment. I'll pick up the stamp as normal and make sure that my main image isn't moving on my cardstock here. To stamp my sentiments, I'm going to use Obsidian pigment ink. This one's great because it's going to give me a great even and dense black. I'm going to remove my focal points here. Again, I used a temporary washi tape to adhere it, but I'm going to leave my background panel in here and stamp my sentiments again. I won't see part of the sentiment as shown here, but now it will help give me an alignment guide when I foam mount my focal image. Then after cutting a little piece of my Instant Dimension foam tape, I'll adhere a little bit to the back, removing the release paper, and then use my sentiment guide underneath my focal image to line up my sentiment. You may need to look directly above your image and down to get the alignment right, which is what I just did. And that finishes this minimal still life sort of scene with one of the many opportunities you can get a freebie from Altenew with your next Crafty purchase. And of course, this card was possible with the colorless blender from Altenew to help sort of push back and move that unwanted ink that I had when I colored this main focal point image. So those are my 3 most common card mistakes and how I either resolve or prevent them. Before you head out, make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss my Perfect Pairing series. It airs every 2nd and 4th Sunday of the month. All of the crafting materials can be found in the description box below. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I'll see you in the next Perfect Pairing.
Hello crafters, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you want to see more, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything. Thanks for watching!